Thanks to Canadian Association. Oh, there we are. I'll start again. Thanks, Robert, and thanks also to the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. I understand this is a subset, the Ontario North and Eastern region, so thank you for the invitation. As Robert said, I've been asked to talk about my work as visiting theatre director at the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. That happened over a 5-year period. COVID put a stop to it. And there's some questions about whether it's going to continue right now. Ironically, the Alberta budget is in crisis because of what's happening with oil. And the program, the university, is very deeply funded by the oil industry. And so it's fascinating to me that as we have to get off of fossil fuels, and I think that it's important we do that, other things are happening also because of that. But the work was to help a cultural shift happen across the faculty, to humanize relationships that had become very mechanized. That was the request. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the Theatre for Living work. I became a professional actor in 1975, a while ago, working across Western Canada in theatre, film, television, and radio. And then co-founded Headlines Theatre, as it was called then, in 1981. We came together to do overtly political work. Our first play, Bye Bye Vancouver, B-U-Y as in purchase, was about the housing crisis in 1981. Because the house next door to where I was renting, big house, sold for $375,000, and we thought the world was ending. That house would now sell for about $3.5 million. I became artistic director in 1984, and my work started to change. First, because of my encounter with the work of Paulo Freire and his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire is a Brazilian. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this book, but I want to say, if you are at all interested in community development work, read this book. And through Freire, encountered the work of Augusto Boal and his Theatre of the Oppressed, both Brazilians, both working in Brazil at around the same time, and their work is very, very connected. Boal and I went on quite a journey together. I met him for the first time in 1986, 84 in Paris. And we went mentor, mentee, then colleagues, and then very, very dear friends. But because of the invitations I was getting, in particular from Indigenous communities here in Canada, to work on issues with them that were a result of colonization and residential schools, they loved what the Theatre of the Oppressed work was, but they didn't like what it did in their communities, because it was polarizing their communities. It has a very strict model of oppressor and oppressed. And in the situations that they were dealing with, issues around addiction and family violence as a result of colonialism, criminalizing members of their community who were actually deeply oppressed, and out of that, doing things that were terrible in their community, wasn't a solution. And so, they wanted work on family violence, and they wanted a promise from me that while we wouldn't condone abuse, the abusers in plays would be put on the stage, not as monsters who needed to be locked up and have the key thrown away, but as people who needed healing, in communities who needed healing, in families that needed healing. This was very challenging for me. I come out of my own dark childhood And I was very committed to there being monsters in the world. It also made my political organizing easier. I knew who the enemy was, and it was those folks over there with whom I disagreed. But they were absolutely correct, these folks. And it forced me to not only change the way I saw the world, but to change the way I was working. And I eventually, what evolved out of that was Theater for Living, and it let go entirely of the very strict binary model that is at the heart of Theater of the Oppressed. Before I get into the U of A, I want to talk about two concepts that are really central to my own work. We know as individuals, if we don't express ourselves, we get sick. If we just keep it all bottled up inside us, eventually that will manifest somehow as disease. I hope we all know that. Well, in the same way that our bodies are made up of cells that make up the individual organism of our bodies, communities are made up of people that make up what I call the living community, the living organism of the community. The way communities used to express themselves was through song, dance, drama, primal language that belongs to all of humanity, not only those people who get to stand in the light. But recently, in the evolution of humankind, those activities have become commodified along with everything else. You know, I mean, in the last couple hundred years. And so now we buy music, we buy dance, we buy theater, we buy TV, we buy books, we pay strangers to tell us stories about strangers. When do we get together as living communities, not to tell his story, her story, their story, but our collective stories? The answer is, to a very large degree, we don't. And in the same way that individuals get sick when they can't express themselves, so do communities. I think the proof of that is everywhere we look. And so I get invited to come into communities and use this primal language, in my case, the theater. If I was a visual artist, it'd be murals. If I was a musician, it'd be making music somehow, to help communities tell their collective stories. And in this case, about things with which they're struggling, so that we can find solutions to issues inside the community. And while all this was happening, I realized I'd become really tired of dealing with the symptoms. Yes, we know there's a lot of violence in the world. Do we actually need another play to ring the alarm bell and tell us there's violence in the world? When do we get beyond dealing with the symptoms and into the root causes? So, you know, like in a family violence situation, yes, of course, there is an emergency. The people who are the victims of this violence need help to find safety, however that manifests. But is that the end of the story? It can't be the end of the story, because the question we actually have to be asking ourselves is, why are we as a culture creating so much violence? And how do we stop doing that? And the only way really to do that is, if you're making theater about it, is to put every single character on the stage in all of their complexity and humanity. So there are no caricatures. You know, Paulo Freire in The Pedagogue of the Oppressed writes quite eloquently about how sometimes oppressed communities fight revolutions, and sometimes they win, all too often only to become the very oppressors they were fighting against. We see this happen over and over again. Why? Well, I think nature gives us one reason why, and that is that we trick ourselves into believing that we are prisoners of the structures that oppress us. But those structures didn't drop in from outer space, just like the oppressors in the world didn't drop in from outer space. Communities grew them. Nature teaches us it is patterns of behavior that create structure, not the other way around. And so if in our work, all we focus on is structural change, and don't get me wrong, I think structural change is very necessary. We're in an emergency to change structures. But if we only do that and neglect the patterns of behavior that create and support those structures, we're doomed to recreate the same oppressive structures over and over again. And so, not everything is good for everything. In my experience, theater that tries to focus on structural change is often really bad theater. Because the strength of the theater is human relationship. It's about human beings and how they struggle with each other. And so in my own work, I know a lot of people doing really good work on structural change. And in a healthy activist ecology, there are many different ways to work. And so the theater work supports the structural change. So then, in 1994, or maybe 95, a woman named Pamela McLean got in touch from the University of Alberta. She wanted to know if I'd come to the U of A and do workshops with the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. The learning institution was in a crisis, and they wanted something innovative to try to open up issues that they were having a hard time dealing with. She'd read my book, which we'll get to later, and thought this might be a good fit. And she managed to organize a 2-day workshop. I don't know how she did this, with people who were really busy, like department heads, high-level surgeons, students, even the dean came. And we started this 2-day process just working in what is the building block of this work, which is making images. Now, I want to explain a little bit about this before I start talking about the work. This image is created because I've asked the people in the workshop, all of them from the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, all of them struggling with issues inside the faculty and their own professional lives, personal lives, to put up an image about something that they're struggling with inside the faculty. We don't have a tighter focus than that just yet. And this image, created by one of these people, opens up a very important conversation about the culture of silence that permeates the faculty. And I should say, in my work, I'm never asking the image maker to explain the image. In fact, I forbid them from doing that. We're not doing this to serve the image maker. I'm interested in what the living organism in the room, the psyche that's in the room, how it perceives this image. And how our experiences of it intersect or collide. And the images in this workshop really set the tone for the next 5 years. So this thing about culture of silence became very, very important. This image of the very strict hierarchies that exist across the faculty, which is built on a broken foundation. And again, in the animating of this image, and animating the images means, keep in mind, the people in the image know what they're talking about. They're not actors pretending they know about something. And so getting the characters in it to say words at first, then phrases and sentences, to do that with each other, to move in small ways, opening things up, to ask because there's other people in the room here, there's the other workshop participants, sometimes there's a larger audience, to come into the image. If you've been one of these characters, come stand in the same shape as the character, be honest. And 10 people come and take the role of this woman lying on the ground here, or 6 people come and take the role of the guy in the blue, and own it because they understand it and have very different perspectives about what's happening. And we learn tremendous amounts from that because the story has become an image that the whole room owns. So after this workshop, this went down very, very well. And the invitation came from the dean to continue the work. So I started going there for 1 week at a time, twice a year. And the work was very, very challenging. Why? Because it turned into 3-hour sessions. That was like the most time we could get with these people who were very busy. I would never see the same people again. They would come into the workshop with pagers on them. The pager would go off and they'd go, "I'll be back," and run away to the emergency ward, save somebody's life, and come back into the workshop. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later, but here are some of the images that came out of those workshops. A workshop on the relationship between grad students and their supervisors. And this thing that nobody wants to talk about inside the culture of silence, which is harassment. This was a very courageous image that this woman put up. People from the emergency ward. What's happening here? Who are these people? This opened up a very interesting conversation. The guy in the back, he might be a patient, and the two people in front, medical professionals, or the two people in front, a medical professional and a family member, and he's being excluded from the conversation. Or he might be the medical professional and the two people in front are family members. Or he might be a family member and the two people in front are the patient and a medical professional. And in all those three cases, the lack of transparency is getting in the way of good care. Again, from the emergency ward. Medical professionals go through a lot of trauma and they have no way to process it, not in the environment I was in. And if you start to fall apart, if you go into crisis, it is seen as a sign of weakness. This is a pandemic inside the medical profession. I've come to understand this. And these women are my heroes. They work in the pediatric ward, pediatric emergency ward. They have children dying on them on far too regular a basis. And not only do they have to deal with that, but they have to go deal with their parents who are in a waiting room, who are going home without their child, and then get back to work. And what this led to, the conversations around this, was the institution of at least monthly sessions to deal with trauma. I did get quite frustrated. And I ended up, after around the third year, because I didn't think we were getting anywhere. I didn't understand what I've just told you in the middle of it. And I went into a meeting with the dean and faculty heads because I thought we should stop. I thought we were just spinning our wheels. Because, you know, I was only there for a week at a time. I don't live inside the community. And I expressed my concern that we were just spinning our wheels. And they went, "Are you nuts? We're seeing real change, cultural change across the faculty. And we're certain it's because of the theater work." And I had to really reframe what I was doing. And I said to them, "Look, I'm going to apologize in advance for the image I'm going to give you. But if you recognize that the faculty is in itself a living thing, I believe that. And that each 3-hour workshop is one acupuncture needle. Each individual needle in and of itself has very little effect, but the collective needles help the organism heal. I'm doing structural acupuncture. at the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. And they said, we understand why you're apologizing because it's an alternate medicine image, but yes, you're right. And this really helped me. It helped me understand actually the work I'm doing, not just the Faculty of Medicine. I want to talk about this larger play, one of many plays, this one called Maladjusted. Created and performed by mental health patients, family members, and caregivers. How are all of us being asked to adjust to a maladjusted mental health system? One that's become so mechanized, in part because of the DSM-5, this diagnostic Bible, and also the mandated length of visits and other things, that the system actually isn't serving anybody well anymore. The central question being, how do we humanize mental health? It played in Vancouver in 2013 and toured British Columbia and Alberta with the tremendous support of Alberta Health Services into 27 communities. Everywhere it went, it was brought in by collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous health organizations. And it was used to change grassroots policy at local levels everywhere it went. And before I get into it, I want to explain forum theater. Because this wasn't images, this was a play. In forum, the play builds to a crisis and stops. It offers no solutions. It's as if the play turns around and says, we have these real problems and we really don't know how to solve them. What do we do? So you perform the play once so the audience can see it, and then you perform it a second time. The second time, the audience can yell stop, can stop the action of the play. If they understand the struggle, the character, in my work, any of the characters are in, and they have an idea about how, by replacing the character and entering their struggle, they can solve the problem somehow. In the case of Maladjusted, it was to humanize mental health. In other plays, like a play on homelessness issues, it was to create safe and appropriate housing. In a play about reconciliation issues, it was to create true and honorable reconciliation. So the invitation changes from project to project. I want to show you some images. This is the publicity image that we shot to publicize the project. It got, as you can imagine, a great deal of attention. This is the original workshop group and cast. All of these people, either mental health patients or family members or caregivers. So they all come in with tremendous knowledge. And I want to say, when I'm doing work like this, there are also people hired full-time who are there as support people if they're needed. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. The work is very, very self-supportive. And so I'm just going to show you some images out of the process. I'm not going to talk about them too much. I just want you to see them. Keeping in mind, all of these are made by one of the people in this image. And we're looking at their struggles with the mechanization of mental health. All of these images, a lived, real moment, now turning into symbols. I'll also say that the guy in black who's sitting with a blank look on his face is a psychiatrist who quit psychiatry because he was so fed up with dealing with how mechanized the system had become. And he was a tremendous asset to this project. The set, a big, beautiful set, a big thing to tour. It had to go up and down every day. This is 15 people on the road, a 5-ton truck. I'm showing you this because it's also important to me that the work, the theater work, is good art. It's not the good intentions of the project that shifts consciousness, in my opinion. It's the artistry. And so the play begins. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. Here's the psychiatrist in his office, drowning in budgets, which determines so many things. This mother has brought her 16-year-old daughter to see him. Her best friend died a year ago and she's still sad. And she's 16 and is acting out the job of a 16-year-old. And her mother is fed up and she wants her daughter fixed. She has good intentions. And she's taken her to a psychologist who's referred her to a psychiatrist. This is a true story. Who in a 20-minute interview, checking some things off on a paper, declared her bipolar and put her on very heavy drugs. And when I talked to audiences about this and asked them if they recognized this story, always at least 80% of the hands in the house would go up, sometimes performing to houses of 300 people who knew out of their own experiences that this is happening way too often. The guy on the sofa, homeless character, who has finally found housing with the help of a social worker, but unfortunately is very inappropriate housing for him. At the intake, there are no drugs allowed, and he is on legitimately prescribed anti-anxiety pills, and they get taken away from him. And he goes nuts on them. And that leads to other very terrible things in the play. And so lots of things happen in the play, and eventually these two young people meet in the street. And it's a beautiful little scene where we see they actually see and hear each other in a way that nobody else is doing. And it's a very tender scene that is also very frightening. She runs away from it. And he ends up following her home. And a big argument happens because he's done that. And he ends up back in the clinic where, because he's in such terrible shape now, gets apprehended, injected against his will. And the last scene of the play, this is actually how the set works. This isn't a manufactured photo. He's in his office. She takes out a shard of glass that she has found in the street, in the scene in the street, and put in her bag. And the last thing we see her do is start to cut. How did this change policy? It's a play about human interaction. It's not a play about the policies. But in the forum theater events, there was a scribe that was hired in every community that it went to. And that person's job was, when we were taking interventions from the audience, and there were times when I could say to the audience, this idea that's come onto the stage that's either really succeeded in humanizing mental health or not. Sometimes we have the biggest lessons from the things that fail miserably. Nobody leaves the stage shamed. What out there is either helping or getting in the way of this idea becoming real? In terms of policy, in terms of legislation, and things would come from the audience who know about this stuff. They're not people sitting in a room somewhere legislating, or the CEOs of companies. They're people who are living the issues. And the scribe was taking notes. And reports about this were going to the mental health organizations who had brought us in with commitments to really pay attention. All that stuff also went to Alberta Health Services. The health services in British Columbia, interestingly, weren't interested, but Alberta was very interested because they're in Edmonton and they were connected to my work at the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, and they understood what we were doing. And there were things that shifted on the ground in grassroots levels. Lastly, I don't like to be the guy selling the book, but this is my book. If you, I don't know if you know who Fritjof Capra is, the foreword by Fritjof Capra. Capra is a world-renowned physicist, because the transition in my work that I talked about for the invitations from Indigenous communities was also led by my own lifelong interest in physics and how everything is in fact interconnected. That we live in a world of energy, not science fiction, not weird mumbo jumbo, but physics, fact. That we are now just understanding that what Indigenous communities have known all along, that the birds and the trees and the rocks and the fish and the humans are brothers and sisters somehow, is in fact true at a physical level. Given the truth of that given to us initially by quantum physics, but now being proven through lots of other scientific study. And so I'm going to finish there because I really wanted to have time for conversation. We have just under half an hour. I'm going to stop screen sharing. I hope you have questions, comments.
David, I'm going to stop the recording, and I might free up some more questions and conversation for you. So,
and I also hope you'll become visible.